Hello. Before I begin the lectures on chapters 2 and 3, and both will be in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about some inconsistencies that you might notice, but you don't have to worry about them. I've taught this class a number of times. It began as a face-to-face class in a classroom that was supplemented by D2L, and then we ran a pilot D2L course winter of 2014, and now we're running the official course this winter 2015, and we'll be using these modules in the future as well. In the past, the course has been a different number of weeks in the semester, 15 weeks, 7 weeks, 5 weeks. From now on, we're hoping that it will always be 5 weeks in the winter semester. So right now, I'm doing my best to standardize all of the notes to 5 modules, 1 module per week. The other thing that I'm doing is updating the notes, because we're using a new edition of the book. You can use any edition of the book, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th, but the latest edition of Worden's book is the 4th edition, and I'm sure there will be more editions after this. But you can use any edition because I've updated my notes. I update the lectures anytime something changes in his books. So the notes that you download and print are all the most current notes. The only time I update the notes in a video is when something changes in the content. So for instance, in the video you might notice that in the video might say it's chapter 3, but really on your downloaded notes it says chapter 4. That's a minor inconsistency. You'll notice that the content of the notes has not changed. If the contents of the notes change, I will actually redo my lectures. So hopefully that will help you to avoid some confusion. All of the content of the notes should match the notes you download in PDF that I've uploaded to D2L. And the only inconsistency might be a chapter number, or if I say in the beginning of the video, greetings, this is week such and such, and you're on a different week, but the content will be the same, and all the modules for D2L will be labeled correctly, Module 1, Module 2, Module 3. Okay, so hopefully that will help you avoid some misunderstandings related to the inconsistencies. Let's talk about Chapter 2 first, understanding the mourning process, or the grieving process, from Worden. And he begins by talking about stages, but we're quickly going to move towards tasks, because tasks is really the contemporary focus of counseling individuals who are grieving, both uncomplicated and complicated. So tasks. People don't normally pass through the stages of grief in seriatim, or in an orderly process. Many tend to take stage theories a little too literally. Oh, I'm done with stage 1, I can move on to stage 2. In reality, and even Kubler-Ross talked about this in her books, we may move through a stage and then come back to parts of it that are still unresolved at a later time. And that's perfectly normal. So it's okay to take 3 steps forward, 1 step back every now and then. They are not quite as orderly as we might want to believe. Phases. Bowlby and Parks talk about these instead of stages. The period of numbness that occurs close to the time of the loss, yearning for the deceased to return and denying the permanence of the loss. Anger might be experienced. Disorganization and despair, finding it difficult to function in the environment. Reorganized behavior, pulling life back together again. Very similar to stage models. Bowlby and Parks add some nuances that I do believe improves a bit on stages. And Sanders uses 5 phases: shock, awareness of loss, conservation, withdrawal, healing, and renewal. And then we move into the more contemporary modes of thinking, the task models. And I think both Rando, she has a wonderful book on grief and task modeling. She was one of the original task theorists. And then Worden picked it up, came up with a textbook, and also added his own nuances to task theory, which I believe is really a combination of Worden and Rando. So let's look at task models, or the tasks of the grieving process. I like the word tasks because it implies that the mourner must take some action, or, as Freud would say, do some grief work, in order to progress through the grieving process. Mourning can also be influenced by outside intervention, like counseling or support. So when we look at the tasks of mourning, task 1, to accept the reality of the loss. This goes along with a lot of the previous models, stage and phase. Acceptance of the death is both intellectual and emotional. It may seem very unreal in the beginning. If an individual doesn't accept the reality of the loss, they may enter a form of denial. In extreme cases, people have kept the deceased body with them for days before notifying the authorities. I was with a couple that lost a dear pet, and they wanted to keep their dog with them instead of burying the dog. And so I fully understood their process of not wanting to let go. And yet we had to work through that. More common examples would be keeping the deceased's room just as it had been before the death, not wanting to change anything. Often people deny the meaning and or emotional impact of the loss. Selective forgetting represses memories of the deceased. Some deny the irreversibility of death or believe in spiritualism and reunion after death, and that's perfectly acceptable. That's part of our religious belief system. And I personally believe that myself. But you could have any belief system that fits who you are. Task 2, to work through the pain of grief. Schmerz, you might have heard that word. It's German. It includes physical, emotional, behavioral pain that people experience after loss. Pain is part of the grieving process, though people experience it on different levels and different intensity. And we talked about some of the signs, both physically and emotionally, that people might experience through loss. If people don't engage in the task, they tend to cut off their feelings or deny the present pain. This also may interfere with feelings in general as well. It may also result in more serious depression. They may avoid or stop any painful thoughts regarding the deceased. This might be done by idealizing the deceased or using alcohol or drugs or even medication. Some individuals move to a new location or throw themselves into their endeavors such as work. I think this might be a good time just to reiterate that many times people are so emotionally distraught and feel such anxiety with a loss that their family physician or a psychiatrist might prescribe some type of anxiety medication, whether it's a benzodiazepine or an SSRI or a combination. Sometimes these medications, though useful for a very short period of time, let's say a couple days, may have a detrimental effect in that it prevents task 2 from occurring, working through the actual emotional and physical pain of grief. So then, after a year or 2 years, when people say, I'm feeling a lot better now, I think it's time that I got off this medication, then when they do stop taking the medication, they find themselves right back in stage 2 again, experiencing physical and emotional grief. So it often just delays this process. Task 3, to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing. So there's 3 areas of adjustment: external adjustments, how the death affects one's everyday functioning in the world. People go through their days. That other individual was included in that daily routine, and now that has changed. Internal adjustments, how the death affects one's sense of self. That has a number of different layers to it. How do I feel about myself in relation to this loss? How do I feel emotionally? Spiritual adjustments, how the death affects one's beliefs, values, and assumptions about the world. Is the world a fair place? Is it not a fair place? So I go into a little more detail about each one of these here. External adjustments. Depends a great deal on the previous relationship with the deceased. It takes quite a while to realize that what it's like to live without this other person. This could even include finances, a daily routine, who made the coffee in the morning, things like that. It takes quite a while to realize what it's like to live without that other person physically. There is a need then to develop new skills and perceptions due to the new roles once carried out by the deceased. This is the most tangible adjustment, and it's often very difficult. There's lots of dynamics. Just somebody we might confide in. Internal adjustments. The survivor must also adjust to a new sense of self, a self-definition, self-esteem, self-efficacy. Some have defined self through others, thus part of the self-definition is lost with the deceased. Self-efficacy may also be related to locus of control, which is also affected by death. Spiritual adjustments. One's assumptive world view may be reevaluated as a result of death. Is the world a just place? Is it benevolent? Does the world make sense? Is the person worthy? What role does religion play with what do I actually believe? Has my life meaning changed? Has the role of religion or my belief system changed? Am I questioning my belief system? And that occurs very often. For instance, God, how could you let this happen to me? Something like that, the questioning stages. And that is often a process. And it can strengthen one's belief system. Many people get stuck in this struggle as well with complicated grieving. And that counseling would help with that. Task 4, to emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life. It sounds a bit harsh, I know. But this has gotten much more advanced in the past 10, 15 years. To find a place for the deceased that will enable the mourner to be connected with the deceased. But, it's not bit, it's but in a way that will not preclude him or her from going on with life. So, I also believe, as Worden and Rando, that our relationship does continue with the deceased in some way. That individual who was close to me in whatever way influenced who I am. I have changed as a result of my experience with other. And that other person is now part of who I am. Another example would be when I have a question in my life, I often think about, well, if I was talking with my mother or father, what would they say to me? So I have an internal dialogue. So, I think that this is a positive thing. Our relationship changes, but we move on with our lives. Vulcan, mourning ends when the mourner no longer has a need to reactivate the representation of the dead with exaggerated intensity in the course of daily living. Counselor's task then becomes not to help the bereaved give up their relationship with the deceased, but to help them find an appropriate place for the dead in their emotional lives, a place that will enable them to go on living effectively in the world. It becomes a transformation, a reframing, a paradigm shift. This phase may be hindered if the individual holds on to the past too strongly and is unable to move forward. It can be characterized by not loving. So, I think that however we reframe the relationship, so for instance, how I talked about and maybe thinking about decisions. Well, what would my mom and dad say about this? They probably both say sometimes similar things, sometimes different things. What would my grandmother say? How would they react? What would they say to me when I am struggling about myself in some way? And it has helped me, those thoughts, in many ways. Another way to transform the relationship would be in storytelling. So rather than telling stories through a grieving process, the stories of those individuals become very positive things. So for instance, if I was going to talk with my children about my parents, their grandparents, I would tell funny, insightful stories about them, things that I have learned from them, my experiences with them, so that my children could better understand my relationship and who their grandparents were. All right, Chapter 3, Mediators and Mourning. These are pretty straightforward, but I'm going to give you a brief overview. They have different types of mediators. They're numbered. Each task is mediated by different factors that affect the progress and the intensity of grieving. So each type of mediation affects the intensity of the grief in each task. So we're kind of taking the understanding of tasks and mediators of those tasks into a deeper consideration in this chapter. Who was this person that is deceased? What was their relation? What were they like as an individual? And that's a very general statement, but we get into a little more depth with number 2, the nature of our attachment with that other individual. What was the strength of the attachment, the security of the attachment? Was I in a significant relationship with them for my entire life? What was this bond that I had? The ambivalence in the relationship. Ambivalence can lead to regret or guilt, and that leads to my model and Adrian Tomer's model that we'll talk about later. Was there a conflict with the deceased? could lead to unfinished business, especially if it was severe. And unfinished business or regret both lead to complicated grieving. Are there dependent relationships, codependence or dependency of any kind, emotional, financial, physical? What was the mode of death? The proximity, where did the death occur? Was it sudden or expected? Was it in a car crash? Was it violent or traumatic? Was it expected after a long illness? Were we able to talk and have closure? Or was it totally unexpected, without closure? Were there multiple losses? Was the death preventable in any way, including if there's litigation? One thing that we do know is that if there's litigation involving a deceased, grieving does not end until the litigation ends. Ambiguous deaths, so deaths where there are questions, or stigmatizing deaths. So all of these things really relate to how we experience the grieving process. Mediator 4, historical anecdotes. What has been experienced prior to loss? Have you experienced other losses? What's your current mental health? Do you have any family issues? Mediator 5, personality variables, the age and gender of the person's coping style. What coping strategy does the person use who's grieving? What was the attachment style? Is your client optimistic or pessimistic? What's their ego strength? What's their self-esteem? What's their self-efficacy? What's their beliefs, values, worldviews? Are there social variables? Mediator 6. Do they have support? Do they have family, friends, perhaps some type of religious organization, work, any type of support system here? What is their support satisfaction? Do they feel as though they can call upon that support? Does it help them? How much support do they have? Their social role involvements. What religious resources? What ethnic expectations? And the last mediator is, do they have concurrent stresses? Are they experiencing other stresses like career stress, financial stress, relationship stress, other emotional stresses? Secondary gains can be found in social support systems, which could be positive or negative. When is mourning over? Well, we talked about the year of firsts. So the normal grieving process, the most intense grieving, is at least a year. And then we begin to reframe after that first year. If it goes on longer than 2 years in an intense way, we might consider complicated grieving. Maybe, depending on the intensity, even after 1 year. But that doesn't mean we don't think about that other person, that we don't experience times of sadness or reminiscing after 10 years. It's about how the mourning and grieving affects our ability to function on a daily basis. And if we're unable to function appropriately, then after a year we might want to consider more counseling resulting from complicated grieving. Okay, I hope that helps to explain chapters 2 and 3. Thank you.